I bought Franz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth 20 years ago, November 1998. And it's taken me 20 years to get around to reading it. But a lot of the books that I bought 20 years ago and that I've only just started to read, I feel it's been good to wait 20 years to read them, because now the content of these books is so much clearer, more understandable. I'm just going to read an extract from Franz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And this is in the first chapter that he writes concerning violence. And this reminds me a lot of the situation of the invasion of Iraq. Of course, he's talking about colonization, and people who are colonized he names as natives, because this was the term that was used at the time. So this is the term that he's using in his book, published 1961. So he says on page 33, as soon as the native begins to pull on his moorings and to cause anxiety to the settler, he is handed over to well-meaning souls who in cultural congresses point out to him the specificity and wealth of Western values. But every time Western values are mentioned, they produce in the native a sort of stiffening or muscular lockjaw. During the period of decolonization, the native's reason is appealed to. He is offered definite values. He is told frequently that decolonization need not mean regression, and that he must put his trust in qualities which are well tried, solid, and highly esteemed. But it so happens that when the native hears a speech about Western culture, he pulls out his knife, or at least he makes sure it is within reach. The violence with which the supremacy of white values is affirmed, and the aggressiveness which has permeated the victory of these values over the ways of life and of thought of the native, mean that in revenge the native laughs in mockery when Western values are mentioned in front of him. In the colonial context, the settler only ends his work of breaking in the native when the latter admits loudly and intelligibly the supremacy of the white man's values. In the period of decolonization, the colonized masses mock at these very values, insult them, and vomit them up. This phenomenon is ordinarily masked because during the period of decolonization, certain colonized intellectuals have begun a dialogue with the bourgeoisie of the colonialist country. During this phase, the indigenous population is discerned only as an indistinct mass. The few native personalities whom the colonialist bourgeois have come to know here and there have not sufficient influence on that immediate discernment to give rise to nuances. On the other hand, during the period of liberation, the colonialist bourgeoisie looks feverishly for contacts with the elite, and it is with these elite that the familiar dialogue concerning values is carried on. This reminds me of the invasion of Iraq, when the US was feverishly looking for contacts, Iraqi contacts with whom they could work. And what's interesting, a theme throughout this chapter written by Fanon, is that it's almost like the promotion of, inverted commas, Western values is used as a way of conning the native population that has experienced nothing but beatings and oppression. And Fanon continues here. Now, what we must never forget is that the immense majority of colonized people is oblivious of these problems. Actually, let me just go back one sentence. He says, the colonialist bourgeoisie when it realizes that it is impossible for it to maintain its domination over the colonial countries, decides to carry out a rearguard action with regard to culture, values, techniques, and so on. Now, what we must never forget is that the immense majority of colonized people is oblivious of these problems. For a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land. The land which will bring them bread and, above all, dignity. But this dignity has nothing to do with the dignity of the human individual, for that human individual has never heard tell of it. All that the native has seen in his country is that they can freely arrest him, beat him, starve him, and no professor of ethics, no priest has ever come to be beaten in his place, nor to share their bread with him. That's a very deep statement, that when it looks like the occupied, colonized people are about to rise up, in essence, and act definitively to throw off the colonizer, it's then that the colonizer appears to reach for, inverted commas, rationality, reaches out to rationality, starts to try to discuss with those people that it has imprisoned and abused and oppressed, starts to try to reason with those people and tries to remind these people that the values that the colonizer is espousing are timeless, universal values. Well, this is not what the colonized people have experienced. And in the colonized country, the intellectuals play an interesting role, colonized intellectuals, as Fanon highlights. They, as Fanon says, are only interested in augmenting their own power in their country, and so they see it as profitable to cooperate with the colonizer and join in with the colonizer to try to reason with the so-called masses and to try to persuade the masses, to talk them into submission and to undermine their culture and values. And this is what we see going on across the world today. Whichever country you go to, we can see a kind of monoculture, a crass monoculture that has been implemented on every high street, in every village, and that has destroyed a people's sense of self. All they can do is work like crazy at the bottom of the pile to try to get by, to try to get on in this system.